The day Marcus Aurelius stopped speaking, Rome fell silent. Not a single sound could be heard anywhere. The palace fell silent. The Senate fell silent. Even the generals became afraid of their own inner voices. Because when an emperor abandons words, only truth remains, and whatever remains after that is the reality of the state itself. That morning, not a single command came from Marcus. Not a question, not an approval, not even a single reply. It was as if he had become a living ghost, as if he had forgotten the very existence of sound, as if he had torn Rome's noise from his mind and thrown it away. He had achieved this, yet no one could understand it, because this was a truth only Marcus knew. This was the mind-cleansing method he practiced. It was not anger, not protest, not a collapse. This was purification, a cleansing. Marcus had long felt that words were polluting his mind. Every word he uttered made his thoughts murkier. The more a man speaks, the more scattered his mind becomes. The more noise he creates, the more he loses the silence within. He stops focusing on himself and becomes a prisoner of the words he speaks. And the greatest enemy of an emperor is not the barbarians outside, but the noise inside his mind. The barbarians outside could be defeated in battle. Rome had the strength for that. But a scattered mind, a contaminated will, no army could ever cleanse them. Even if the entire empire stood united, it would not be enough. Every day in the corridors of Rome, countless voices swirled around him. Gratitude, complaints, praises, warnings, rumors, demands. All of them poured into Marcus's mind like a flood made of 1,000 drops. A flood that darkened his thoughts, and each word placed another stone upon his mind. Stone after stone, until the weight became unbearable. Eventually, those stones made every movement difficult. The mind grew heavy. Awareness faltered. Truth became buried under noise. Truth was crushed beneath the weight. Marcus sensed this collapse, and he stopped. He refused to speak without thinking. He refused to react out of reflex. He silenced every noise. For 21 days, he truly did it. Even he did not know how radical this decision was. But after the first hour of silence, he felt something. If there were no words, there was no chaos. If there were no words, there was no slavery to emotion. There was only his inner world and Marcus. When the soldiers brought him their reports, he answered only with a nod. The general's debates burned in the silence, yet with a single glance he issued judgment. One glance carried more meaning than any sentence. In the Senate's endless speeches, he ruled without uttering a single word. He was a ruler whose power was felt even in silence. Because speaking is easy, silence is a battle. The first battle a man fights within himself. The first and hardest war declared against one's own emotions. That day, Marcus Aurelius understood. Speaking is the reflex of the body. Silence is the discipline of the mind. And an emperor must be the master of his mind, not his body. As silence deepened, it sharpened him. As it sharpened him, it cleansed him. As it cleansed him, it strengthened him. For 21 days, Rome was ruled not by words, but by the shadow of a silent man. And that shadow gave birth to one of the greatest disciplines in history. Today, I will tell you what happened behind the curtain of those 21 days. And perhaps you too will understand. Sometimes the greatest power is saying nothing. The first day of silence was not as simple as it looked. It was nothing like what it appeared from the outside. When Marcus Aurelius woke that morning, he felt the weight of his decision not to speak for the very first time. The words rising to the tip of his tongue, the thoughts brushing against the edges of his mind. All of them were part of a habit. And habit is the greatest chain a man carries. It steers him. and becomes the hardest obstacle to defeat. Speaking was easy, quick, reflexive, especially for an emperor whose slightest gesture was awaited by hundreds. A command, a direction, a judgment. But Marcus chose silence for precisely that reason, because a man decays most easily in the place he is most accustomed to. When the palace servants opened his door, the shock was not in the sounds. It was in the absence of them. Marcus said nothing. He simply lifted his head. The look in his eyes replaced every word he could have spoken. That simple movement held more power than most sentences he could utter. An emperor's silence could frighten people, but Marcus cared for none of it. None of their fear mattered, because this silence was not for them. It was a war he had declared for his own mind. A war he believed he could win. A war he was determined to win. The first day was the day the battle raged most violently inside him. Whenever he stepped into crowded rooms, the urge to speak rose in waves. It was a human urge, and resisting it was incredibly difficult. The reflex to answer a question, the impulse to give an order, the need to explain something. All of these forces pushed him toward speech, but each time he stopped himself, took a breath, and stayed silent. Silence in those first hours was like a punch. It struck the mind heavily. It shakes a person, throws him off balance, because speaking is the body's defense mechanism. Silence strips that defense away, and a defenseless mind is forced to face itself. Marcus did not run from that confrontation. If he had, silence would never have lasted 21 days. He might have endured an hour, a day at most, but he chose the battle. When he entered the Senate with silent steps for the first time, the same expression spread across every face. A confused fear, a curiosity that could not be understood, lips that wanted to ask, but dared not. The senators spoke, debated, offered proposals, demanded solutions. Every one of them waited for Marcus to say one sentence, but he only listened, silently. And in that moment, something became clear. Marcus's silence weighed more than their words. Because when an emperor falls silent, only truth remains. Not the decoration of language, not the shadow of claims, not the chaos of noise. Truth. By the end of the day, when Marcus returned to his tent, something within him had begun to settle. The noise had lessened, the thoughts had grown heavier. Silence was still difficult, but it was no longer foreign. For the first time, a space opened inside his mind, and Marcus understood that this space was not fear, but a doorway. The first day had begun as a burden of silence, but by evening, it was turning into a weapon. That was why the silence protocol would continue, because the first thing to be defeated were the words, and the next thing to fall would be the noise of the mind. The second day of silence was the day the real war began. The first day, the body resists. The second day, the mind. The longer Marcus Aurelius remained silent, the louder the noise inside his mind became. It grew until it nearly drowned out the sounds of the outside world. This noise was a man's inner voice, the voice he hides even from himself, the voice of his deepest fears, his dirtiest thoughts, his most forgotten wounds. Speaking buries this voice. Silence drags it to the surface. Marcus wanted exactly that, because until a man silences his tongue, he can never truly hear himself. On the second day, the palace servants were more uneasy. The curiosity of the first day had turned into a quiet tension. An emperor's silence was more dangerous than rumors of betrayal, because no one knew which way the wind would turn. But Marcus did not carry this silence as a threat. He carried it as a purification. Every morning he sat down and watched his thoughts pass without saying a word. Some thoughts drifted by quickly. Others were heavy, clinging to the mind like wet cloth. But he held on to none of them. He simply observed, because silence is a man watching himself. Modern people have forgotten this. Speaking, arguing, reacting, all have become reflexes. No one thinks anymore. Everyone just responds. Marcus remained silent because he saw this clearly. An emperor's silence was a truth he was trying to win, not against the world, but against his own mind. The hardest moment of the second day was the general's council. As they spoke of the state of the war, their eyes constantly searched Marcus's face, waiting for a sign, a comment, an order, a single word. But Marcus only listened, and that listening shook them, far more than any speech could, because a man who speaks can be understood, but a man who stays silent cannot be read, and a leader who cannot be read is the strongest leader in the room. Marcus's silence placed a hidden pressure on the generals, because silence forces a man to hear his own voice. For the first time, they felt the full weight of their own words. Every sentence fell heavy, echoing against the stillness Marcus created. By the end of the day, Marcus went out for a walk. The air was cold. The wind struck his face. But the noise within him was harsher than the silence outside. With every step, his mind cleared, and with every breath, his thoughts grew heavier, sharper like a blade. And in that moment, Marcus Aurelius understood. Silence is the most merciless teacher a man can have. It teaches the lessons a man least wants to face. As he stripped away words, the true face of his mind emerged, and Marcus did not look away, because an emperor must first know the darkness within his own mind. By the end of the second day, silence was no longer a burden. It had become a discipline. The first front of the mental war had been crossed, but Marcus knew the real battle would begin on the third day. By the third day, silence was no longer a habit. It had become a mirror, and when a man sees himself in that mirror, he first recoils, he fears, then he begins to recognize the truth. Because silence does not just illuminate the outside world, it shines a light into the hidden chambers within. It exposes the inner landscape. Everything that hides in darkness becomes visible. Fears, regrets, selfishness, secret desires. All the shadows tucked away in the corners of the unconscious. All the thoughts a man wishes to bury. Marcus Aurelius knew he would face these shadows that morning, because silence was no longer a simple absence of speech. It was the soul stripped bare. It was the self revealed in its most unprotected form. When you do not speak, others may fail to understand you. But when you do not speak, you begin to understand yourself. And that is far more dangerous than any battle fought in the world outside. For a man does not fall when he faces others. He falls when he faces himself. On the morning of the third day, Marcus sat long at his writing desk. The pen rested in his hand, but he wrote nothing, because silence quiets not only words, it quiets thoughts as well. As crowded thoughts fall away, only the essence remains, and essence always hurts. He did not go to the Senate that day. He did not summon his generals. He did not signal the palace servants. He did nothing but walk through long corridors, across wide courtyards, listening to the wind strike the stone with its sharp, cold sound. The more he remained silent, the louder the world seemed. People spoke more, faster, more desperately, as if Marcus's silence unhinged them, because when one man stops speaking, the words of others suddenly lose their meaning. By midday, several generals demanded an audience. Is His Majesty ill? Is something wrong? Your silence is unsettling the army. They were worried, but there was no answer. Because there was no answer to give, what was happening was far too inward, far too deep for them to grasp. Only the truly wise could understand such a state, which meant only Marcus could. He listened to their concerns, only listened. One of the generals paused mid-sentence, his breath caught, because in that silence, he heard his own fear echo back at him. And that was the lesson Marcus wished to impart. Silence forces a man to hear his own voice. And most men are terrified of that voice. They do not want their inner world to speak, for it speaks only truth. When evening came, Marcus withdrew to his chamber. A single candle burned. Shadows trembled on the wall. The silence was heavy, but no longer foreign. His thoughts felt clearer, cleaner, sharper. The fog in his mind was beginning to dissolve. When a man is silent, he cannot hide. Not from his character, not from his weaknesses, not from his anger, not from his greed. He cannot hide from any part of himself, because silence is not a prison. It is a naked reality. It is the soul reflected without disguise. That night, Marcus accepted what silence revealed to him. His greatest enemy was not outside, but buried deep within his own mind. Others would never understand this. They would think their emperor was running away from words. But Marcus was not fleeing. He was approaching himself. By the end of the third day, silence was no longer unbearable. It had become a teacher, a painful teacher, but a necessary one. And Marcus knew, behind this pain was a doorway, and that doorway opens only to those who dare to remain silent. The fourth day, silence was no longer merely an inner war. It had become a force that bent the outer world as well. Because the more Marcus Aurelius remained silent, the more the voices of Rome began to change. People's posture, their breath, their fear, their curiosity, all of it started moving to the rhythm of his silence, shaped by his silence. When an emperor speaks, everyone finds direction. But when an emperor falls silent, everyone loses theirs. No one knows where to stand or where to move. And this was the birth of ruling without words, the beginning of silent dominion. On the morning of the fourth day, the generals were not summoned, yet they still came, because a silent ruler casts a heavier shadow than one who speaks. Words create leadership, but silence creates absolute authority. General Claudius delivered a long report. The state of the war, the shortage of supplies, the drop in morale. He spoke and spoke. But with each sentence, the weight in the room grew heavier, because Marcus gave no reply, and the general began to feel the burden of his own words. At one moment, Claudius paused. His breath shook. His tone changed, because in front of him was not a mute emperor, but a mirror reflecting back his own errors. Silence magnifies the flaws within a man, and no sound is sharper than the echo of one's own shortcomings. Marcus slowly lifted his head. He said nothing, yet that single look felt like a decision, a command, a judgment. Claudius fell to his knees. He stopped speaking. He understood what the silence meant. Marcus's silence was heavier than any punishment. Later in the day, the Senate gathered. Normally, their debates would last for hours. But this time, something felt different. Every senator felt Marcus's silence watching them. One gaze from him cut through their words, like a blade. They shortened their sentences, made fewer claims, breathed more carefully. In a place where words lose value, thought becomes sharp. And this was exactly what Marcus intended. By evening, silence was spreading through the palace. The less Marcus spoke, the less others dared to speak. Because noise comforts a man, but silence strips him bare. When night came, Marcus withdrew to his chamber. He lit a single candle. Even the faint crackle of the flame seemed heavy in the quiet. In that depth of silence, he realized how weak words truly were. Speaking was easy. Issuing commands was easy. But ruling through silence, that required something far deeper. That night, he thought, a leader's true power is not in the words he speaks. But in the moments, he says nothing. If an emperor can rule even in silence, then he is a true ruler, because silence forces people to feel the weight of their own thoughts, to see the shadow of their own mistakes, and no decree can ever achieve that. By the end of the fourth day, Marcus finally understood. Silence was not only purification, it was dominion. And this dominion was not won with armies, but with minds. The fifth day, silence was no longer a wall, but a doorway, and Marcus Aurelius stood before it. If he stepped through, he would descend into the deepest chamber of his mind. If he turned back, he would surrender himself to the noise of the old world. But he chose what every leader avoids, to remain alone with the naked truth inside him. The less he spoke that day, the more the noise in his mind began to fade, as if thoughts had stopped crashing into one another, as if emotions had ceased their desperate running, as if the storm within him was slowly searching for a place to rest. Silence wounds a man in the first days, but on the fifth day, it teaches him. The palace corridors were still full of murmurs. Rumors continued to spread. The emperor has fallen ill. He awaits a sign. He might be speaking with the gods, or perhaps he has been defeated without a battle. Everyone talked, because talk is how people try to cover up what they cannot understand. But Marcus walked in silence, each step a judgment, each breath a reckoning, each glance a quiet acceptance. That afternoon he entered the library. Thousands of books lined the shelves. Wisdom, war, philosophy, medicine, law, worlds built from words. But Marcus walked past them all. Words felt heavy now, because silence lightens words, and lightened words no longer nourish a man. In the deepest corner of the library, he stopped. He took no book. He simply sat, drew a long breath, and remained silent. An emperor who does not work, an emperor who does not write, an emperor who suspends even thought, was incomprehensible to Rome. But Marcus chose this incomprehension willingly, because silence does not force thought. Silence purifies it, and only a purified thought can create a true decision. The hardest test of the fifth day came at dusk. A messenger arrived with urgent news. A small skirmish had broken out on the northern border. Normally, Marcus would have issued an order immediately, called his commanders, reacted without hesitation, but this time he stayed silent. He received the message, read it, placed it on the table, and said nothing. Everyone waited for a word, a sentence, a plan, a signal. But Marcus did not break his silence, because he understood something. To speak does not always mean to solve. Sometimes speech drives a man farther away, to a place unreachable even to himself. Silence brings him back to center. That night, he sat for a long time in the chair beside the candle, his eyes heavy, his breath deep, his mind empty. Emptiness, not frightening, but healing. Silence returns a man to himself. He thought, and long years later, this truth would remain unchanged. On the fifth day, Marcus Aurelius saw the true nature of silence. You do not weaken by holding your tongue. You do not shrink. You cleanse, and in cleansing, you strengthen. And a strengthened mind is untouched by the noise of the world. No noise can shake a mind that has become strong. On the morning of the 21st day, silence was no longer a goal. It had become a nature, a state of being. When Marcus Aurelius awoke, he did not force himself not to speak. There was no effort, no resistance. Because silence was no longer a decision, it was an identity. A wise identity he had earned through an inner battle only he could fight. Words no longer wandered through his mind. Emotions no longer pushed him. Reflexes no longer tugged at him like old chains. They no longer held power. Marcus had outgrown them. Silence had rooted itself deep within him, and for the first time, he felt not emptiness, but clarity. As he walked through the palace corridors that morning, no one dared look him in the eye. The silence of a ruler carried a weight greater than any army. As Marcus moved forward, the crowd stepped back. Paths opened on their own. No one questioned him. No one awaited orders. Everyone simply waited. For an emperor could rule even without speaking. Authority sometimes spreads through presence, not through sound. For 21 days, Marcus tore out the noise within him. He faced his fears, watched his anger, restrained his desires, illuminated the shadows of his thoughts. Silence became not only discipline, but a weapon. That day, when he stood before the Senate, hundreds of eyes fixed on him. No speeches began. No senator stepped forward. It was as if Rome held its breath for one man. Marcus took a slow, deep breath. For the first time in 21 days, not to speak, but because thinking had finally finished its course. Then he opened his lips and spoke one single sentence, a sentence that shook Rome and froze the Senate. We no longer need unnecessary words, nothing more. Yet that lone sentence carried the full weight of 21 days. For a word born from silence cuts sharper than a blade. Few syllables, immense impact. In that moment, all understood. Marcus's silence was not weakness, it was transformation. An emperor had first conquered his own mind, and the one who conquers his mind conquers the world. Rome's leader did not change that day, but the leader of Rome changed himself. The silence ended, but the strength it taught him stayed forever. If you see a part of yourself in Marcus's silence, subscribe and leave one sentence in the comments. Silence is strength. Because sometimes the ones who change the world are not those who speak, but those who know how to remain silent